Welcome to English Through History. If you enjoy the content, please subscribe or leave us a review. It helps us to create more content and is appreciated by our small team here. We hope you enjoy the episode. Last episode, we heard about how the North Korean forces supported by Soviet tanks managed a surprise attack on the poorly prepared South and completely overwhelmed the country, taking Seoul in just 3 days and forcing the leader, Syngman Rhee, to flee the capital and the southern forces to be pushed to the very southern tip of the peninsula, fighting a brutal war of survival and making a last stand around the city of Busan. In today's episode, we will be talking about the outcome of the war and how the seemingly unstoppable North Korean forces were tactically outmaneuvered by a coalition of UN forces led by a resolute American president and a daring American general. We hope you enjoy today's episode. The Busan perimeter, as it was known, was a desperate last stand against overwhelming forces. The perimeter stretched along the Nakdong River in the west. What was known as the Sea of Japan at the time is now known as the East Sea, and the surrounding mountainous regions, forming a roughly 140-mile defensive line. The perimeter represented the last stand of UN forces in Korea. If the perimeter had fallen, it is likely that North Korea would have successfully unified the peninsula under communist control. The forces defending the perimeter included South Korean troops, American forces, and smaller contingents from other UN member states. General Walton Walker of the US 8th Army was the overall commander of the forces within the perimeter. Throughout August and September 1950, the NKPA launched several major offensives against different sections of the perimeter, particularly targeting the Nakdong River line. These attacks aimed to break through the perimeter and capture Busan. However, despite being nearly overrun several times, the perimeter forces held as finally supplies and troops arrived from the sea to the beleaguered defenders. Air superiority, naval support, and the arrival of these reinforcements, including tanks and artillery, helped bolster the defenses. The rugged terrain around the perimeter, especially the high ground along the Nakdong River, also provided defensive advantages to the UN forces. Further north, the American forces have been planning an attack of their own. General Douglas MacArthur, famed World War II veteran and war leader, was tasked with retaking the initiative. General MacArthur believed that an amphibious assault at Incheon, a coastal city close to Seoul, could cut off North Korean supply lines and force them to retreat from the south. He saw it as an opportunity to reverse the dire situation faced by UN forces, which were still defending the Busan perimeter. The landing at Incheon was considered extremely risky due to its narrow channels, extreme tidal variations, and well-defended approach. General MacArthur, however, was willing to take the risk. On September 15, 1950, UN forces primarily composed of US Marines launched an amphibious assault on Incheon. The operation was supported by extensive naval and air bombardments. Despite the challenging conditions, the landing was a stunning success. The North Korean forces were caught completely by surprise and were unable to mount an effective defense. After securing Incheon, UN forces quickly advanced inland and recaptured Seoul by the end of September. The successful landing effectively severed the North Korean supply lines and forced them to retreat in disarray from the southern part of the peninsula. As the Incheon landing unfolded, UN forces in the Busan perimeter, which had been holding off relentless North Korean attacks for weeks, launched a counteroffensive. With North Korean forces diverted and weakened by the Incheon operation, the UN troops broke out from the Busan perimeter and began advancing northward. The combined pressure from the Incheon landing and the breakout from Busan led to the rapid collapse of North Korean positions across South Korea, and within weeks, UN and South Korean forces had pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel, reversing nearly all the territorial gains made by North Korea since the start of the war. However, it is at this point that the Southern forces discovered an opportunity to take the North and unify the peninsula. And so, following the success at Incheon and the recapture of Seoul, UN forces continued their advance into North Korea. By October 1950, they had crossed the 38th parallel and were moving rapidly towards the Yalu River, the border with China. The rapid advance of UN forces towards the Chinese border alarmed the People's Republic of China. In response to this, China intervened in the late October 1950 with a massive influx of troops, the People's Volunteer Army, which led to a new phase of the war. The Yalu River marked the border between North Korea and China, and Chinese leaders, particularly Mao Zedong, feared that UN forces might invade China or destabilize its northeastern region, which was Manchuria. The Soviet Union, China's ally in the communist bloc, also encouraged Chinese involvement. The Soviets provided air support and military equipment to North Korea, but they were reluctant to commit ground troops, leaving China as the primary actor to intervene on the ground. The Chinese initially launched a series of limited engagements, testing the strength and tactics of UN forces. They used their familiarity with the terrain, surprise tactics, and massed infantry, particularly in the Battle of Onjong and the Battle of Unsan. In an unexpected twist, the Chinese launched a major counteroffensive in November 1950, catching UN forces off guard. Chinese troops inflicted heavy losses on UN forces, forcing a retreat southward. The Chinese offensive pushed UN forces back across the 38th parallel by the end of December 1950. Seoul was again captured by Chinese and North Korean forces in January 1951. The Chinese continued to push southward, but by this time UN forces had stabilized their lines and reinforced their positions. The UN launched a series of counterattacks, leading to a back-and-forth struggle across central Korea. These battles saw intensive fighting with heavy casualties on both sides. The Chinese suffered from logistical difficulties, including shortage of supplies and equipment, which began to limit their offensive capabilities. By mid-1951, the front lines had stabilized near the 38th parallel, leading to a stalemate that would persist for the next 2 years. Both sides engaged in trench warfare, reminiscent of World War I, with neither side able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. By 1953, all parties were exhausted by the prolonged conflict. The war had caused significant destruction and loss of life, and both the UN and communist forces were under domestic pressure to end the hostilities. The death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in March 1953 also contributed to a change in the international climate, with the new Soviet leadership more willing to support a ceasefire. And so, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on July 27, 1953, by representatives from the UN Command led by the United States, North Korea, and China. South Korea did not sign the agreement as President Syngman Rhee opposed it, hoping instead to continue the war to reunify Korea under his government. The armistice established a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, roughly along the 38th parallel, which became the new border between North and South Korea. The DMZ itself is about 4 kilometers wide and serves as a buffer zone between the two Koreas. The situation continues to the present day. No official peace has ever been declared between the two countries. Estimates of total deaths during the Korean War range from 2.5 million to over 3 million, including military personnel and civilians from both sides. It remains one of the bloodiest wars in modern history. And that concludes our episode for today. We hope you have enjoyed it. Next week, we'll be releasing another episode, so please stay tuned for that.